Hi, I'm Michael Killen. I'm going to have a discussion of one of the most interesting state senators from California. He's interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of them is he represents one of the most interesting areas in the world, Silicon Valley. And he is Joe Simidian. Hello.
Hi, Michael. Good to be with you.
How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. I've just driven back from the state capitol. It's a long drive, and it's good to be home.
Yes. Now, your district, am I correct, goes from the ocean, Santa Cruz, part of the big city of San Jose, all the way up towards San Francisco, San Carlos. It includes powerful Palo Alto and San Mateo and a few other places.
It's got 13 cities or towns, or at least portions of 13 cities and towns, and you're right. It's San Carlos in the north all the way down to Santa Cruz and Capitola in the south. It's one of those artfully drawn districts that your viewers read about in the newspapers. But it's 931,000 people in 13 cities and towns in 3 different counties, yeah.
And these are the folks you represent.
That's right.
And when you sit back and you look at this body of land and the people in it and the industry, what do you think about with respect to how you are going to help us?
Well, it's a remarkably diverse district, in part because it is a collection of 13 very distinct communities, each one of which has its own sort of strengths, challenges, community cultures. You think about, San Carlos is not Santa Cruz. Atherton is not San Jose. East Palo Alto is not Palo Alto. Each one of them is, as I say, different communities. And my job really is to strive to be able to represent all 931,000 people equally well. So whether it's a welfare mom or a classroom teacher or a union machinist or a high-tech CEO, they're all mine, I'm theirs, and if I do my job well, I'm able to understand what's important and what matters and what the needs are of every one of those folks.
Is there a common thread?
Well, as you described it, I think it may sound obvious, but it does have a big impact on the way I do my work. It's an incredibly bright, well-educated, and engaged constituency. And if you've both grown up here as I have, and if you've represented folks here for a long time as I have, you can take that for granted until you talk to some of your colleagues, and it's very clear in a hurry that the districts they represent are very different, and they'll have their own strengths and their own challenges, but it would be a mistake to think that the area that we represent here in Silicon Valley is like the rest of the state. It's a very different place.
In the last year, what do you feel is the most significant thing you have done for your district?
I think I'm going to cheat a little here and take 2, if I may.
Sure.
The first, I would say, just because it's recent, is you may have noticed just about a month or 2 ago, the governor signed into law my legislation, Senate Bill 2X. This is the renewable energy bill that commits California to get 20%, to go from 20% to 33% renewable energy by the year 2020. And it is a huge, huge step forward, not just in terms of environmental issues. Yes, it's a clean air bill. Yes, it's a climate change bill. But also in terms of energy policy, in terms of protecting Californians against the kind of market manipulation we saw a decade ago during the energy crisis, because we'll diversify our energy portfolio and we won't have all of our energy eggs in one basket. But it's also a huge job creator, and it's a huge job creator all around the state. Yes, it's good for Silicon Valley, but we're also talking about wind and solar and geothermal and biomass in some of the rural parts of the state that are really even more hard hit economically than our area. So, as I say, it's an environmental bill, it's an energy bill, it's a jobs and economic development bill, and the low end of the estimates is probably 100,000 jobs, anywhere up to 250,000 jobs connected with taking that leap from 20% renewable to 33% over the next decade. Now, a very different issue just the year before was a bill that's called the Kindergarten Readiness Act of 2010.
Well, could we stay on this one?
You want to stay on that? Sure, absolutely.
All right. This bill is called 2X.
2X, And the
2X.
reason it's 2X is because the X is for the extraordinary session in which it was heard.
Okay, and this requires, I guess we have 4 or 5 major utilities in the state and a lot smaller ones, something of that nature.
We've got 3 principal investor-owned utilities, PG&E, Southern California Edison, and then San Diego Gas and Electric. But then we've got a host of municipal utilities as well. And one of the things the bill did that's important, Michael, is it said not only are those investor-owned utilities, the big 3, going to have to get to 33% by 2020, but so will our municipal utilities as well.
All right. I think the bill is significant, but how is the utilities taking this bill?
I would say mixed. We ended up with support from both San Diego Gas and Electric and from Southern California Edison. PG&E, however, opposed the bill to the very end, and ultimately, when Governor Brown signed the bill, he had to take a look at who was on the support list and who was on the opposed list, and PG&E was still on the opposed list, okay, in spite of our best efforts to try and bring them along.
Okay, a little while ago you said this bill is going to create jobs.
Yeah.
Is it going to create jobs in this respect? It sends a message to the utilities. You have to find sources of renewable energy. And it sends a message to entrepreneurs that a market is certainly going to emerge now for wind, solar, thermal.
Well, exactly right. I mean, to grossly oversimplify a very complicated set of issues, I would say in many ways the simplest but most significant part of the effort is that clear message has now been sent to the market. The market will respond. Had we not sent that clear message, then the investment dollars, the tax revenues, and the jobs associated with the growth of renewable resources would have gone to some other state or some other nation. By virtue of sending that message, California now, I expect, will be the beneficiary of those investment dollars, those tax revenues, and those jobs, and that was one of my goals. But it's important to lay down a clear marker and one that's real, and that's also long-term. So folks who are looking around the world for places to invest in terms of renewable energy now know California is talking about a big leap forward from 20% to 33%, and that's a commitment over the course of the next decade that they can literally and figuratively bank on.
So investors, corporations around the world clearly can determine how much California is spending right now on energy. They can forecast 2020, and they can take 1/3 of it and see billions and billions of dollars of business opportunities.
That's right.
Now, I want to ask, I think we knew this bill was coming from you for a while, the marketplace.
Well, and yet, I had hoped to finish this off at the end of 2010, and the bill died on the Senate floor literally the last day of session. On the last day of session, when the clock strikes midnight, you're done. And so if the bill hasn't moved by then, you're out of luck until the next year and the next session. I heard immediately from renewable energy leaders in Silicon Valley that they had heard within a matter of 48 hours from their investors on the East Coast, sources of finance, that in the absence of the bill, they were rethinking their commitment to investing in California, which is why I was glad when we got to the new year that we were able to take this measure up in the extraordinary session that I referenced, which allows us to move things along a little faster. And so rather than go a whole year more without sending that message and making that commitment, we were able to, in a matter of a few months, finally finish it up, send the message, and make sure that the dollars kept coming to California and that the jobs continued to be created here.
Now, have you seen any major corporation, major investors already starting to act on this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the prior legislation that I authored was a bill back in 2006 that committed California to 20% by 2010. And so we've actually had an opportunity to see, has this worked in recent years? And the answer is absolutely it has. And as difficult as the economy has been up and down the state and even here in the valley, if you look at what are the handful of growth areas, the clean energy, green energy, renewable resource world is one of the very few bright spots over the last 4 or 5 years. So people were putting their dollars into the market, knowing that we were committed to 20% by 2010, and then the next question was, are we going to make that commitment even greater over a longer period of time? And once that message was sent, people have said, great, we're in.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the opportunities in a moment. But does your bill allow the utilities to obtain uh, fossil fuel energy from outside the state or green energy from outside the state?
Well, of course, the two-thirds of the energy is still not necessarily renewable, but the big debate we had, and this was a struggle I had with Governor Schwarzenegger, who vetoed an earlier version of the bill, is, all right, what qualifies as renewable energy for purposes of the bill? And there are a host of sources. That wasn't really the issue. It wasn't a debate about wind versus solar or biomass or geothermal or wave or whatever the other possibilities were. One of the issues we had is in-state, out-of-state. And while on the one hand you want to provide flexibility, and that means out-of-state sources included, I think if California ratepayers are going to be picking up the tab, they ought to have the benefits in terms of tax revenue, investment dollars, jobs, not to mention clean air. So there was some tension around that. Ultimately, the way the bill was crafted, most of the energy that is required, the renewable resources that are required, can either be in-state or directly connected from out-of-state. And that just means that if there's going to be wind in Wyoming, that we know it's real wind, that it's going to be directly connected, and we can see it, feel it, use it, and know that it really is renewable energy. Some of this will be, however, renewable energy credits, and that's essentially a trading mechanism to say, well, the energy's over there, we can't get it to California where we need to, so somebody else will actually use the energy, but they'll be able to trade a renewable energy credit. There's a developing market, and I'm okay with that, but I wanted to make sure we were looking at real, clean, renewable energy, not just pieces of paper that could be backed by a dirty lump of coal, and that to the greatest possible degree, that the real renewable energy was California-based, because that's in California's interest, not just for clean energy, clean air, climate change reasons, but for economic development reasons as well.
All right. I followed. But I would like to know, now that this bill has passed, let's say I'm a business person, when will I see some rippling effect?
Oh, you're seeing it now.
Give me an example.
The bill was signed last month, and on the day that it was signed, Governor Brown decided he would do the bill signing in a very public event at a solar power facility, that a manufacturer in Milpitas here in Silicon Valley. And the Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu from Washington, D.C., from the Obama administration, came to the bill signing event and announced on that day federal grants and loans that we're going to bring significant funds, and I apologize, I just can't remember the dollar amounts, for the next steps here in California. And once that commitment is made, the businesses that are there, SunPower was the business in this particular case, know that they can continue to seek out investment and that they can continue to pursue markets in California because they know the market will be there. They don't have to speculate about whether if they go through this process to create renewable energy, there will be a taker. There will be a taker, that's clear now.
Okay, so your bill 2X.
Yes.
Right. It's sort of over here, and it adds teeth, would I say, to California's larger AB 32, its Climate Solution Act?
Well, AB 32 was passed in 2006, and I was a co-author in the bill with my colleague, then Assembly Member, now Senator Fran Pavley. And the bill actually came through the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, which I chair now and chaired then. So I had a chance to work closely with then Assembly Member Pavley. And, you know, AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, lays out a framework. It says we're going to tackle climate change. We're going to lay down some markers about what we're going to be able to do by the year 2020 and the year 2050 in terms of scaling back our greenhouse gas emissions. But then the question is, how do you do it? Now, one of the ways you do it is by using renewable energy. But that's only one of the ways you do it. I sometimes a little bit frustrated because I think people think of the renewable energy bill as a greenhouse gases bill, and it is that, but it's also a clean air bill. It's also an energy policy bill. It's also a jobs and economic development bill. I would even argue that it's a foreign policy bill to the extent that it helps America pursue American interests and values.
Sure.
But back to AB 32. So yes, it's one of the things that is real and tangible that reduces greenhouse gases, but there are other things as well.
Okay. And you've been involved in another bill maybe, or there's another bill, I think 375?
Senate Bill 375, which was passed gosh, back in 2008, it was authored by my colleague, Senator Darrell Steinberg. And what he said is, look, renewable resources, that's one way to reduce greenhouse gases. But one of the other areas where we generate a lot of greenhouse gases is in buildings and transportation. So if we could rethink both land use and transportation, link them together in a way that's smart and that minimizes the generation of greenhouse gases, that would be a major contribution as well. Now it was, I thought, sort of underappreciated at the time. I think over time people will appreciate the significance of Senator Steinberg's work, because really what he's saying is, going forward, we're going to have to think about local land use planning and development with an eye not just towards community compatibility, but also with what's the impact on greenhouse gas generation. And that's a whole different frame of reference for most of us who've ever sat through a local city council or planning commission meeting.
Right. Now, you brought up two things: land use, and I think the minute Sacramento starts talking about imposing its wishes on the counties, on the communities, and then on the citizens, people who have property, people start pushing back. And then you linked it also to climate change. And I know we have a lot of enlightened people here in this area and in this state, but not really that many. So you sort of linked one thing that brings up a lot of negative resistance, not from me, and the benefit, slowing the growth of climate change, is something that a lot of people aren't even tuned into. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think we should give the public more credit. And I was really heartened by the campaign last year in 2010 on Proposition 23, which was an effort to roll back the AB 32 requirements. And, it not only failed, it failed by a pretty significant margin.
Yes.
And it wasn't, I think it's particularly important, I want to focus on this, and it failed in the midst of the worst recession we've had in my lifetime.
Yes.
So at a time when you would have thought people are going to be susceptible to the notion that somehow tackling this climate change problem is going to cost them out of pocket or it's bad for the economy, the public statewide figured it out and said, no, actually, we don't believe that. This is still a goal we want to pursue, even in the midst of this recession. And in fact, we believe that those greenhouse gas goals can be a catalyst for further economic development in California. And I thought that was the initiative process is sometimes reviled here in California, but I thought it was a very good debate, and I thought people got it. They had the debate, and people got it and said, no, we want to keep moving forward. Now, I do think there is always resistance to somebody else telling you how to do your business. And, this is one of those times when, either we all hang together or we'll all hang separately. We got to figure out a way to come together. I thought what Senator Steinberg did was smart in that he essentially said, we don't want Sacramento telling you what to do, but we've got 18 regional planning organizations that are already out there. Let's let them sort of carry the responsibility for communicating essentially what are your greenhouse gas reduction goals, and then allocating that responsibility at the regional level to different jurisdictions. So just as right now, probably most of your viewers aren't even aware there's a fair share housing requirement that local communities are obliged to meet. Think forward and ask yourself, could there be a greenhouse gases reduction requirement that local communities were required to meet? And then could they start planning land use and transportation in sync in a way that gets us there?
Sure, and put it together. So AB 32's impact, I believe, starts to be felt after the courts adjudicate whether cap and trade has good social justice or it's been articulated properly. But when do you think we, including industry in the state, is going to start to really feel pressure from AB 32?
Well, I think it's harder than people thought. I think it will probably take more time than people thought. And we've already got what are known as early actions. So the California Air Resources Board, CARB as it's sometimes referred to, has already promulgated 2 or 3 different early actions. They're pretty modest. Capture refrigerant coolants from automobiles, low carbon fuels, capture more methane from landfills, these kinds of things. These are not big picture solutions, but they're a start. The great debate that you referenced that's underway right now is about whether or not a cap and trade system, basically a marketplace approach to trading greenhouse gas emissions, is really the way to go. And while, frankly, I've always taken the view self-interest is a pretty powerful force, and so if we can capture or tap into people's self-interest as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think that's probably a worthy pursuit. The question that's being raised right now is, can you do that in a way that's fair to all Californians? Because if you're swapping or trading, does that mean that you end up putting all of the dirtiest stuff in the lowest income communities? That's one set of issues. Another set of issues is, well, if we're going to have a cap and trade system where people are basically trading off the solution for the problem in different parts of the state, maybe different parts of the country, maybe different parts of the world, do we end up essentially, outsourcing all of this in a way that leaves California dirtier while the offsetting is getting done somewhere else? And by the way, if we do that, does that mean that the economic development potential around some of these new technologies goes to the benefit of another state or nation rather than California?
So when does this get adjudicated?
Well, the courts have taken some action recently on this issue of the environmental justice issues and sort of said, no, we think that's probably been handled reasonably well so far by CARB, at least from a legal standpoint. That being said, the court did say, hey, you've got some work to do under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, to make sure you've looked at other alternatives besides cap and trade. But I think over the course of the next 2 to 5 years, things are going to start to be real, to answer your question.
Okay, so you've played a role with the creation of AB 32, landmark legislation for the nation, and also
SB 2X, which is the energy bill.
Right, and also land use activity. What happens, and we don't have too much time, what happens when California makes a success of its Climate Change Solution Act?
Well, the hope is that it will serve as a model to other states and other nations, and that, in fact, we can take action at the national level here in the United States. I remember sitting and having a conversation with Governor Schwarzenegger in his smoking tent, by the way, about AB 32, and he did not see the irony in having a conversation about air quality in the smoking tent, which I thought was obvious. And the question he raised was, well, why should California as a single state step up? We can't solve the greenhouse gas problem all by ourselves. And my response was, we may be a single state, but we're probably 12th or 13th in the world in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. And that means there are 187 nations behind us who are looking to see if we're going to put our money where our mouth is.
Okay, so I heard the word climate change and reducing carbon emissions, but I also heard the creation of jobs.
Right.
And I think from somewhere else I heard you talk about maybe, correctly, AB 32 is a means for this state to make a transition to a new economy and to new jobs. And it's not all about just reducing carbon emissions.
Well, you started the show by pointing out what an extraordinary place we live in, Silicon Valley. And one of the things about the Valley is it has reinvented itself as a matter of economic necessity over and over and over again. Depending on your age, you may remember the fruit tree era. You may remember the aerospace era. You may remember the personal computing era. You may remember the online and space era, and now we're looking at clean tech and green tech and nanotech and blended technologies.
Yes.
And so that ability, if we are there first and best,
we get it.
Then we capture that market space.
Okay. Earlier, you started to talk about something that you were very proud of, education.
Well, and the two. Let's see if I can't tie the two together. One of the things that's interesting to me is when I talk to CEOs in Silicon Valley, if you have a room full of 20 or 30 or more, if you go around the room and ask what's the number one issue you have, what's the number one concern you have in terms of being able to do business successfully here in California, 3/4 of them will say education. And yes, some will say housing costs for our employees, some will say transportation, some may say tax levels, but 3/4 of them say education. And the measure I introduced last year, which frankly, almost no one thought had a chance in the world, myself included when we started, was brought to me by a couple of Palo Alto teachers, a kindergarten teacher and a reading specialist, who said, guess what, we start kids too young in kindergarten. And you know, I'd known that for years. It'd been a topic that I'd heard people talk about. But, you know, how big a deal was it really? And finally, one of the teachers said, I thought it was very, she said, Senator, you don't understand. We've got 6 million kids in the California school system. If they're starting as much as 3 months too young, that means that a quarter of the kids in the system, 1.5 million kids, are starting too young to maximize their success. And they had brought me a petition signed by 287 other teachers. And I said, well, these aren't just kindergarten teachers. And they said, exactly. They're first grade teachers and third grade teachers and fifth grade teachers who are trying to tell you that these problems follow these kids all the way through the system. So after spending a lot of time and energy, we rolled back the start date, so kids are going to have to be 5. By doing that, we shrink the cohort of kindergartners. That saves $700 million a year for the 13 years that smaller cohort goes through the system. That's $9.1 billion in savings. We reinvest that in a year of transitional kindergarten to start these kids out right.
All right, you've been a wonderful guest. My guest has been California State Senator Joe Simitian. He's obviously made a great contribution to the education systems of California, which of course need more work, and the environmental programs in this state as well. And I'm Michael Killen, and with what time we have left, I want to announce that in July, my coast-to-coast tour of an art exhibition begins, and it begins in the city of Palo Alto. And I will present the world's largest painting on sustainability, and someday I hope it will be called the most influential. And then it immediately moves to the county office of Santa Clara County in August, and then I believe it's going to go over to NASA at Moffett, and then it's going across the country to Florida. And I welcome all other government agencies, if they would like to gain access to this art exhibition, if they contact me. And you know, it's Michael Killen, michael@killen.com. And again, my guest was State Senator Joe Simitian. Okay.